The Prologue isn't Honda's first EV, but it is definitely their most important to date, because not only is this going to be sold everywhere in the United States, it's one of the best values in the US in the EV segment, giving you more range for less money than most of the competition. Let's talk about why you might or might not want to put a Prologue in your driveway. Before we get any further, we should talk about the elephant in the room. And it's not that the heavens have suddenly opened and it's raining, it's the fact that the Prologue is built on the same Ultium platform as the Blazer EV and the upcoming Equinox EV. Honda has been given a pretty hard time about this relationship, but I actually think it's a good deal for Honda and a good deal for people that might be interested in the Prologue. You get Honda styling, you get the fact that this is probably going to qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit, and it came to market sooner. If Honda was going to design an EV all in-house, it would have taken longer to bring one to market. It probably would be built in Japan, because that's where they're building a lot of other EVs, and it probably would not have gotten the tax credit as a result. So you may or may not like it. Let me know down there in the comment section, but my personal opinion is that this is a pretty good pairing. Now that we've talked about the elephant, it's time for me to put my hood up and talk about the Prologue. I think the design is clean and elegant. I also think it's going to be more timeless than the Blazer or Equinox EV. So if you plan on keeping your EV around for 10 plus years, I think I would steer towards this design direction than the more busy, more pointed styling direction of the Blazer EV. The front end definitely looks very Honda, and it also looks very upright. So versus something like an EV6 or some of the Hyundai models, you might want to take a look at this if you prefer a bigger, boxier style. We have Honda LED headlights there with LED turn signals inside, the big distinctive Honda bar, and there are going to be a bunch of different accessory looks if you want to take this in a slightly different styling direction, including a very Jeep-esque 7-slot grille right there in the middle. Of course, we have LED fog lights below, and before we go further, I should say this is a top-end Elite trim, but interestingly, the base model and the top-end model look very similar on the outside. Dimensionally, the Prologue is pretty similar to the Honda Passport. They're right about the same length and right about the same width. As you can see, the hood line also is pretty similar because this does have that upright and boxy look that a lot of people are looking for in a new EV. The downside is efficiency. It's not quite as efficient as some of the sleeker and lower hooded competition. But I do appreciate the boxy style because even though the greenhouse pinches in a little bit towards the rear, it doesn't become as narrow in the back as many EVs, and that certainly makes it more practical for adults and taller children in the back. The roofline, however, that definitely drops versus the Passport, so even though this is as long and as wide as a Passport, it's notably lower to the ground. Then, of course, we have that skateboard-style battery pack underneath the vehicle that occupies a bit of space, resulting in the interior feeling a little bit higher off the ground, even though ground clearance is lower than we find in a Passport. The best angle for the Prologue, for me at least, is the back end. I think that they really did a good job of making the rear look clean and elegant, and easy to clean, I suspect, because everything here is pretty flat surfaced, but we have some additional 3D detail under the clear lens covers, for instance, in these full LED taillight modules. We have a pretty big hatch here, but as we find in a decent number of EVs, you'll notice that the cargo area itself is fairly high because, of course, we have the availability of all-wheel drive and a dual motor setup. Wiper fans rejoice. I know you're out there because I see a lot of comments in the comment section. The Prologue has the polar opposite wiper situation of a Cybertruck. Instead of a huge wiper, it has one of the smallest wipers I've ever seen back here. It's maybe about 6.5, 7 inches long. Not quite clear where we're going to find refills for that, but it is handy that it has one. According to Honda, the Prologue is going to give you the most range in its segment, 296 miles, for the lowest MSRP, $47,400 plus destination. We will slice and dice that later in the video, but if you're cross-shopping this against the base competition, there are a few things to know. Perhaps the most important of which is that Honda puts the single motor up front, rather than in the back like we find in a Model Y, or an Ioniq 5, or an EV6, ID4, etc., 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 or its close relative, the Chevy Blazer. The single electric motor is good for 212 horsepower, 236 pound-feet of torque. Now, there is a reason you don't want a motor in the back of your Honda, and that is if you drive on slippery surfaces like ice or snow regularly, or you want to maximize regeneration potential, because that is going to be slightly better on the front axle. If you've ever driven a rear-wheel drive EV with aggressive regenerative braking in the snow, you will notice that regeneration has to get dialed considerably down because of the dynamic impact of that braking just on the back axle. Now, if like Sir Mix-a-Lot, you want a motor in the back of your Honda, you can get one. It's a small electric motor, and that brings power up to 288 horsepower, 333 pound-feet of torque, but it's always going to have a strong front bias. That's also why fuel economy doesn't actually drop very much for choosing the all-wheel drive option. From 296 miles of range down to 281 miles of range for most versions. If you get the Elite trim like this, it drops a little bit further down to 273 miles. All of them are going to be powered by an 85 kilowatt hour battery pack, and charging is going to take a little bit longer than some of the competition if we're talking about DC fast charging. 155 kilowatts peak for this model, but AC charging is among the fastest, 11 kilowatts. If you're doing a direct Toyota-Honda comparison, which I could see a lot of folks doing, this is definitely going to charge faster on AC or on DC versus a Toyota BZ4X. And the driving dynamics are not going to be too far off because it also is going to start as a front-wheel drive EV. Bearing in mind I haven't had a great deal of time to spend in this, but I have spent a decent amount of time in the Blazer EV, I find the front seats to be pretty comfortable. These seats are not exactly the same shape and type as other Honda seats, but I don't think most folks will really notice the difference because they're comfortable, they're supportive, they're relatively wide as well. One thing I do think is missing in the top-end Elite trims would be four-way adjustable lumbar support. It is just two-way adjustable lumbar. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column. It has a pretty decent range of motion, but I do think that shorter drivers might not like the fact that the steering column doesn't go quite as far in as some. So shorter drivers might have troubles finding a good driving position, but I think taller drivers will be just fine because the seat bottom track moves pretty far rearward. You can get an idea of just how much room we have here, and headroom is definitely generous up front. With that front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have plenty of room back here. This is the kind of vehicle where I suspect you'd have no problem fitting rear-facing child seats behind a taller driver up front. There's certainly going to be enough room, especially for some of those infant seats. Kids are probably going to be a bit more comfortable in the back seat than adults, however, because you notice the seat bottom cushion is a little bit close to the ground. That's because Honda really wanted to give us as much headroom as possible back here, but you will find more headroom in some of the competition. So if I sit very upright back here, my head is touching the ceiling. So certainly keep that in mind if you frequently carry taller adults or taller teens in the back. Yes, you could slouch a little bit, and if I was in more of a relaxed mode, I would have a bit more room, but to be comfortable on a longer journey, I'd probably want to sit a little bit more upright. Now these seats do offer a two-stage recline. That was in the most reclined mode. This is the most upright mode. There's not a great deal of difference between the two. I actually think that effective headroom is slightly better perhaps in the more upright mode. We of course have a completely flat floor back here in the second row, just as you'd expect out of a dedicated EV platform, and 60/40 folding rear seat backs, but they don't fold quite flat with the rear. I think that's because, check this out, this is a really thick rear seat back, so it is a little bit cushier, a little bit more comfortable than some. Rear seat passengers get a fold-down center armrest with two big cup holders right there. You can see that the child latch anchors are behind these little plastic covers. I do worry that those might break off and get lost, but I do like the fact that they're easy to find, so no fishing around in the seat. Moving here to the middle, we have two big air vents right there, two USB charge-only ports there, 120-volt power outlet that also gets covered by that little cover, and then a tiny little slot where you could store your smartphone. The Prologue may be the same length as a Passport, but it has a lower roofline and a different proportion as well. That's why we don't find as much storage behind this power hatch. Just over 25 cubic feet of storage back here versus about 40 cubic feet in the Passport. You'll notice this cargo area is a little bit shorter, a little bit narrower, and definitely a bit more raked. Versus most of the competition, however, this is on the wide side, especially if you take a look at something like an EV6. The opening of this cargo area is much wider. You'll be able to fit bigger and boxier cargo in here. With the Moto Compacto out of the way, let's take a look at what's under the load floor. Under here, you can see we have actually some wasted space because these big plastic dividers could have been removed and they could have made that load floor drop down by another about 3 to 4 inches, really making the cargo area a lot taller and more practical. On the other hand, we do get this surprisingly deep storage well right there, just inboard of that latch. You can see the Moto Compacto almost fits in there. That does make the cargo area a bit more practical, but again, I just wish they'd removed that plastic divider to just give us a bit more practical storage area. As I said before, there's no front trunk, there's no frunk, there's no frubby going on under the hood. I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity because check out how much space we have there between the radiators and that front inverter and motor module there. Remember that all Prologues are going to have a front motor, The one in the back is the optional one. I would have loved somewhere to put the wide variety of adapters that everybody's going to need when daily driving or especially road tripping an EV like the Prologue. Yes, NACS is coming at some point soon, the new J3400 connector, but for a solid decade, adapters are going to be the name of the game, and I would love somewhere to put them under here so that way you're not rifling through your cargo in the back and not kicking them around in the floorboard area when you're on that longer road trip. For our look around the interior, I've stepped into a model with the sort of baseball glove colored interior because I do think this is the more attractive design. The darker interiors definitely feel very monochromatic. This model has this very large panoramic moonroof. The front glass section opens and it does have a power shade. Travis is hanging out back there, but his head is touching the ceiling. Moving back up front, we find height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable head restraints. Definitely large portions of this interior have a very General Motors feel. There's no real way around that, so let's just talk about what is and isn't shared as we look around. The seat design as far as the upholstery is unique to the Prologue, but obviously some portions of the seat structure are similar to the GM EVs. We have heated and ventilated seats here, and you can get leather upholstery depending on the trim of Prologue you're taking a look at. Moving over to the front doors, we get lots of premium materials on the front doors and slightly less premium materials on the back doors. So that upper section of the door right there by Travis, that is a hard plastic, whereas it's a soft touch injection molded plastic up here on the front doors. We also get a matching insert that matches the outside of the seats right there, and then a big storage area down there at the bottom of the door. This model has the optional Bose audio system, so of course we find a Bose speaker up there on the A-pillar. We then have different textures going on for the bulk of the dashboard, soft touch injection molded upper section, and then this panel right here is a stitched component that matches the seat. You'll see the stitching a little bit later. We then have a strong bar theme running right across the dashboard with, yes, lots of shiny black plastic. I am a little bit concerned about how easy that plastic would be to scratch because last time I was driving the Chevy Blazer, we did notice some fine scratches in that black trim. Down here we find a decently sized bin-style glove compartment, although I think that because it is so square and not terribly deep, you might have troubles fitting some of those large tablet computers inside. Moving up here to the middle, we find the standard touchscreen LCD infotainment system, and yes, it supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. So if you really love Google Automotive, you like what GM is doing with their system, but you want Apple CarPlay, you know what? You might want to check out the Honda instead of the Blazer or that upcoming Equinox. This features all of the latest Google Assistant features, so lots of voice commandability, lots of control over the vehicle's charging schedules, etc., and of course, charge routing. So if I were to go in here and let's actually use the voice command here. Take me to Los Angeles. It's going to load a route for you. It'll tell you that multiple charges are going to be needed, and then it's going to add the charging stops and give you a 30% estimate upon arrival. And then you can choose the route details right here so you can see exactly where it's going to take you. It's going to take you to that EA station, and it's going to tell you how long you'll need to spend there charging. Oh my, 1 hour and 38 minutes. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Obviously, the rest of the interface pretty similar to other Google Automotive systems currently on the market. Down below that, we find two big air vents, the controls for the standard dual-zone automatic climate control, heated and ventilated seats in this particular trim. I like the fact that we have a mixture of physical buttons in this system as well as that touchscreen, because I do prefer physical controls for the climate control in a vehicle. Two USB ports down there. You can see that CarPlay is running wirelessly. I have my smartphone down there in that area. We have a 12-volt port. This very large, flat, horizontal area. There's no Qi wireless charging here. That happens back here in that area with that little sort of a slanted slot there. Two big cup holders, and then yes, because it's an EV, we have a nearly flat floor with a big storage area right there under the center. Moving back here, we find a padded center armrest with contrasting stitching, and then that opens to reveal a pretty deep and large storage area, again thanks to the flat floor design of the vehicle. Over on the driver's side, we do have a heads-up display in this model. It's not quite as large or as colorful as some of the ones that we find in the Hyundai and Kia EVs, but it's definitely there. And then we find this full LCD instrument cluster. It handles glare pretty well. You can actually see the sun's right behind me, but it actually deals with that pretty nicely. One of the things that I really love about this, though, is that we have the ability to not only give us Google mapping over here on this display from the native mapping software, but two-screen Apple CarPlay. So if you really wanted to, for instance, see the Google map and the Apple map at the same time, you could do that. although if you try and navigate with both at the same time, one is going to cancel the other out. That's really a nice feature though, because I do prefer the way that the Apple Map navigation works. We also have some layouts without navigation, so if you'd rather have more of a safety system look, you get that with the media on the other side, but this display is not quite as configurable as the displays that we find in some other GM vehicles. I'm not quite clear why, but Honda chooses to not have all of the software doodads that we find in every GM vehicle. Controls, moving out from there, we find adaptive cruise control over here on this side, some infotainment controls over here on this side, along with the heated steering wheel button. The shifter, that is a column shifter back here, separate stock, drive down there, reverse up there, park with that button right there. Now this particular model has its drive mode disabled, so don't pay any attention to the warning displays that are up here because they wanted to make sure we didn't move it on this particular location. The steering wheel, that definitely looks a lot like other Honda steering wheels, but yes, it has some GM bits grafted in, so those buttons are very GM, but the airbag cover and the logo, of course, that's Honda. To the left of the steering wheel, we find the electric parking brake, sport mode, lane keeping assistance, auto brake hold, and then a dimmer control. You'll notice no headlight controls over there because, as with other GM vehicles, those headlight controls are up here in this touchscreen. A lot of folks have made a big deal out of that. I don't think that's a problem at all because I generally leave my cars in auto mode, so I really just don't care where those buttons are located. Over here, we find the seat memory controls and the door lock and unlock. And that's what those window switches look like. Again, a little bit too much black plastic going on in this area. Wondering what the key looks like? Well, it's not quite what we see out of other Honda models, but you can use an NFC card if you'd rather do that instead of the key. There's not too much of a range penalty for all-wheel drive, but there is a range penalty for choosing the Elite trim. And the reason is right here. We get wider tires, 275 versus 255. So if you want the better handling model, that's going to be the Elite. And we actually get a slightly different wheel design. It is very, very similar to the base wheels. However, there are some slight differences, and the wheel itself is wider to accommodate the wider tires. So it gets a little bit more of a 3D effect in this area. But interestingly, the look is very consistent. So there's not too much of a design penalty for simply choosing that less expensive, longest range base model. Unfortunately, Honda did not have any single motor Prologues to test, so I have spent the entire day in the top-end Elite trim. Keep in mind this is the heaviest version of the Prologue, but it does have the dual motor setup, which gives us more power. In this model, preliminary 0 to 60 times came in at 6.7 seconds. That is a little bit slower than average. I don't suspect that the wet weather had anything to do with that, however, because traction control on, traction control off, there wasn't any wheel slip. Power is decently balanced between the front and rear, but remember, there is more power on the front axle. Not an enormous amount of power compared to some of the competition, but still a little bit more biased towards the front. 60 to 0 stopping distances, I think it would be unfair to comment on those directly because it is so wet outside right now. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's likely going to be a little bit longer than the direct competition, and that all has to do with the curb weight of the Prologue. I don't have official curb weight specifications just yet. Honda said those are forthcoming, so if they come by the time the edit of this video is done, you will see them on your screen, but it's most likely to ring in somewhere around 5,500 to 5,600 pounds. That's the approximate curb weight range of the comparable Chevy Blazer. And remember, this is very directly related to that Chevy Blazer. The important thing to remember is that those curb weight numbers are up to 1,000 pounds heavier than some of the direct competition. A Tesla Model Y is certainly going to be lighter. A Hyundai Ioniq 5 is going to be significantly lighter as well, approximately 1,000 pounds lighter than the top-end all-wheel drive version of the Prologue. That's part of why Honda puts wide tires on this model, 275 with tires on the Elite trim, 255s on the rest of the lineup, so that does compensate largely for that, but that's also perhaps why fuel efficiency is going to be a little bit lower in this than some of those comparable offerings out there that can get away with skinnier tires. I should briefly touch on Ford's Mustang Mach-E. The Mach-E is on the heavy side of the segment, likely not as heavy as the Prologue, but its tires are on the severe skinny side of the segment. Almost all Mach-E's out there are going to have just 225 width tires, and even a Mach-E GT, that only steps up to 245 tires. So a regular Prologue has wider tires than even a Mach-E GT. They're obviously not as grippy, but they are wider, and that means that every Prologue is going to be able to accommodate wider and grippier tires if you really did want to take your handling ability to the next level and sacrifice some fuel efficiency. Now, why is the Prologue on the heavy side? That all has to do with the Ultium platform and some design considerations around it. When Ultium was developed, They decided that they wanted the modules to be independently replaceable, and that is not something that we find in a lot of EVs today. So if you are interested in a battery pack that has a possibility of being serviced in the future, you might want to look at something like this. Now to the question so many of you have been asking, does it really feel like a Honda out on the road, and does it feel different than a Blazer EV? I would say yes, it feels like a Honda out on the road. No, it doesn't feel that much different than a Chevy Blazer. I think the suspension is a little bit firmer than in the Blazer. Bear in mind, I haven't been driving them back to back or on the same road. And I think that the steering rack is a little bit more my preference as far as the feel of the system. Keep in mind, it's still an electric power steering rack, so there's not a lot of feedback coming from the front wheels, but I like the ratio and I like the assist level, the heft, etc., which is minorly tweaked versus the Blazer. Now, the important thing to remember is that when we're talking about vehicles that compete directly Honda to GM, I would argue that there's not an enormous amount of difference in terms of their on-road feel. So something like a Pilot to an Acadia, it's not a world apart. It's not night and day. Something like an Acura RDX to a Cadillac XT4 or XT5, that is a bit further apart, but we're also talking about some major mechanical differences like the torque vectoring axle in the back. Like to like, I would actually say there's not an enormous gulf here. Yes, Honda did tune the suspension here. They made some minor tweaks. They tuned the steering rack, etc., but they didn't make an enormous amount of change versus the Blazer, and I don't really think that's a problem. The Blazer is really nice on the road. This is also pretty decent to drive. If you're torn between models, I think a lot of the decision-making process is simply going to come down to which vehicle feels right for you. If you want something that feels a bit more normative, a little bit larger on the road, you probably want something like this Prologue. I will mention that the cabin is really wide. If I put my arm on the armrest to my left, I'm actually spreading my arms out a lot wider than I would in a lot of EVs. And that passenger side window over there, it's really quite far away. You'll definitely notice the extra width in the back seat if you have adults back there. If you're trying to combine adults and maybe booster seats or child seats or something like that, you're gonna notice that that rear bench is significantly wider than average. That's also an attribute of the Chevy Blazer. The downside, of course, is that the Prologue is not going to be as nimble as some people are looking for. If you're looking for the ultimate electric hot hatch, that's not going to be the Prologue. That could, however, be the upcoming Acura ZDX because that's going to have a lot more power and it's going to have a rear-wheel drive option. So stay tuned for that because hopefully I will be driving the ZDX soon. If that is something you want right now, however, you might want to take a look at some of the rear-wheel drive options. We have the Ioniq 5, we have the upcoming Ioniq 5N, of course the regular all-wheel drive Ioniq 5, which is going to be significantly faster than this and have a very different personality. But there are going to be pros and cons. It's not going to be as roomy as this. The ride quality in some of those higher performance options is not going to be as good as this, especially if you take a look at a Mach-E or a Tesla Model Y. And for the price, the range figures are not going to be quite as good. I have to say, range has been definitely very, very solid in the Prologue. It's a little bit difficult to talk directly because we haven't been driving this on our usual test loops. However, this does appear to actually be able to give you nearly 300 miles of real-world range as long as you're treating the throttle pedal gently. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. 296 miles of range is not EPA highway range. Highway range is going to be a decent amount lower than that. And remember that this is a relatively boxy, relatively upright EV, so those highway range numbers are going to be a little bit further from that EPA combined cycle number than something like an Ioniq 6. If you really want to get 300 miles of highway range, you're going to want to take a look at a sedan, especially a sleeker or sexier sedan, because anything on the boxy side of the EV segment is just not going to give you that kind of real-world highway range. I don't have any official cabin noise scores just yet, but I did think that the cabin could be a little bit quieter. Now, keep in mind, we have been driving it in the rain, so there's certainly more splashing going on in the wheel wells, and importantly, this is the Elite trim with the 275 width tires. Generally speaking, the wider the tire, the more cabin noise you're going to get, the more road noise you're going to get, and I think that's certainly the case here. I would expect that the lower end trims with the narrower tires are probably going to be a little bit quieter. If you're interested in a Prologue, production is already underway and sales are going to start in March of 2024. We don't have official details on the $7,500 tax credit yet, but they have said that they expect it to qualify for that full credit. And that makes sense because GM expects the Blazer and the Equinox to get that full credit as well. Big change for 2024 is that that tax credit can come right off the top. And that puts this at a serious advantage versus a number of its key direct competitors. For instance, the BZ4X may start less than this at around $43,000 plus destination, but it doesn't qualify for the tax credit because it's not built in North America. Now, about that price tag, $47,400 plus a $1,395 destination charge puts this about $3,000 more expensive than a Tesla Model Y. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you do get a lot of standard feature content: Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, power heated seats, 2-zone automatic climate control, XM radio, and that 296 miles of range, notably more range than you'll find in the Toyota BZ4X. If you want the all-wheel drive model, power goes from 212 horsepower up to 288 thanks to that extra motor, and the price tag goes up by about $3,000. To help sweeten the deal, Honda will give you $600 to $750 of charging credit on every Prologue. That can either go towards the installation of a home EVSE or towards DC fast charging if you are more of a road trip kind of person. Although I would suggest if you are planning on road trip charging your EV, you might want to look at one of the faster charging models. If this teal paint job has caught your eye, I can't blame you, but it's only going to be available on Touring and Elite trims. The Touring model adds extra feature content for $51,700. All-wheel drive is still an option on that model for $3,000 extra. If you want the wider tires, the bigger wheels, the nicer interior bits, then you want the Elite trim, $57,900. All-wheel drive is standard on that model. Including destination, you'll be right at $59,295. Coming a little bit later this year, as long as your dealer has checked the right option boxes, you could end up with that $7,500 tax credit right off the top, and that really will make this an attractive alternative to something like a BZ4X, which A, won't get the tax credit, and B, is just not quite as attractive as this. But we should clearly talk about the bestseller in this segment now, the Tesla Model Y. A lot of folks have been saying, but hang on, isn't the Model Y less expensive? Yes, with an asterisk. Depending on how you configure your Model Y, it could be $2,000 less or $1,000 more. The Model Y starts at $43,990, plus $1,390 of destination, plus paint color options, $1,000 to $2,000 extra if you don't want one that's black, and if you want the lighter colored interior, that's $1,000 extra. So exactly which Prologue you're comparing against, your price tag will vary between $2,000 less or $1,000 more, but it's always going to have lower range than this. 296 miles in this model. Actually, this is always going to have more range than that base Model Y period, because that is rated for 260 miles of range. And keep in mind that Tesla is still calculating their range slightly differently, so in the real world, you will get a slightly lower range in the Model Y versus this. Out on the highway, both are going to be below those EPA numbers, but the delta is going to be a little bit bigger on the Model Y. I definitely think that the look is more attractive here than in the Tesla. I like the fact that this looks a bit more normal car, a little bit less, masked Raider or something like that. Although I do like the interior features that we get in the Model Y, including the bigger back seat. That's going to be probably the biggest deal for families, especially with taller teenagers or people that want to put adults in the back. The back seat is going to be notably better when it comes to especially rear seat headroom. We also get an actual front trunk in the Model Y. I really think that Honda and GM could have worked together to give this some sort of at least tiny front storage area, but they chose not to. The Model Y's front trunk is not as big as it once was, but it's still there and it's still eminently practical, and that's a feature that I really appreciate. Also, there is no corollary to the performance version of the Model Y. If you want rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, a firmer, sportier suspension tune, you want to go 0 to 60 really, really fast, you want the Model Y. If you want native North American Charging Standard charging rather than CCS charging, you also want the Model Y. Although it's worth noting that this is going to get an adapter so you can charge at those Tesla supercharger stations coming soon. But what do you think? Are you interested in a Prologue? Would you take a Prologue over some of the GM SUVs, even though, again, they are very closely related? If I were shopping for one, I have to say this is pretty high on my shopping list. I don't road trip in my EV very often. I wouldn't mind the slightly slower charging speed if I did need to use it. And I actually think that the fast AC charging speed is a bit more important for me, especially versus something like the Toyota BZ4X. This is like 1,000 times more attractive than that BZ4X, and it's significantly faster charging on AC, and that is where 90+% of charging sessions happen. The vast majority of new EV owners charge at home or at the office. They're not DC fast charging every day, And in those charging situations, this is going to charge significantly faster than that Toyota and right up there with just about everything else in the segment. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Do you like it? Do you like this color? Which one would you get? And of course, if you really, really hate this GM-Honda collaboration, I would love to know why down there in the comment section below. We will have to see exactly how reliability numbers pan out, but Honda has said that they feel very confident that this is going to behave, be warranted, and be as reliable as a classic Honda model. And that really should tell you something about what Honda thinks about GM engineering and this particular collaboration on this particular EV. So let me know all that down there. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., and I'll see all of you later.